I'll say this. I think it is a failure of our technology transfer organizations within academia and within national labs because they're so focused on the numbers that they have been given as targets. How many patents can we get? Well, having IP doesn't necessarily, result in commercialization, as we know. And so there really is a gap there. And so I know a book can't solve the entire problem, but my hope is that it makes communicating about innovations a little bit more accessible and maybe working with your first marketing teams a little bit easier. And so you're not so overwhelmed with the vocabulary and some of the other things that marketing kind of does to gatekeep.
I'm going to deep dive on a couple sections in the book, but starting with the name, how did you come up with the name Giant's Ladder?
Sure. So, some of this just comes as the result of working with a publisher, right? This was my first book. So, there's an Isaac Newton quote around about standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is something that scientists are very familiar with because no scientist would ever say, hey, I invented this or I came to this discovery completely on my own. And I think science is just such a great field in part because we're so reliant on the entire ecosystem, whether we're talking about the research infrastructure that we're working within, be that Vivaria or, a planetarium, a telescope, it doesn't matter, but we're working within that infrastructure, physical infrastructure. And then, of course, there have been so many discoveries that paved the path for whatever it is that you're working on in particular. And science marketing doesn't really need to be that different. It's not overly complex. I think that marketers tend to gatekeep a little bit to show that we have some special talents, but really what we're doing is we're communicating science, and we're doing it in a strategic way where we're not just talking about the technology, but we're talking about the value and the strategic goals that we can really obtain through this new tool that's been developed or this new test. So we're talking more about being outcomes focused as opposed to how neat the science is. And I think that in order to do that well, you have to like science. You have to enjoy geeking out with scientists. You have to really pull, what is the part of the clinical microbiology lab workflow that you're truly improving on with this innovation? Tell me more. Helping those scientists communicate the end value, how the end user is going, or the purchaser is going to benefit. And that piece is so critical for early stage companies. And I don't think that there is enough focus on that early messaging and story building. And there really should be. And I think that this is, and I'll say this, I think it is a failure of our technology transfer organizations within academia and within national labs because they're so focused on the numbers that they have been given as targets. How many patents can we get? Well, having IP doesn't necessarily, result in commercialization, as we know. And so there really is a gap there. And so I know a book can't solve the entire problem, but my hope is that it makes communicating about innovations a little bit more accessible and maybe working with your first marketing teams a little bit easier. And so you're not so overwhelmed with the vocabulary and some of the other things that marketing kind of does to gatekeep.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, completely agree, right? So, it's interesting because there's obviously a wide range of target audiences, right? In terms of how you're going to even of the approach, the right, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of marketing and who your target audience is, right? And thinking through that. And you talk through a lot of that in the book. I really identified at the kind of early on, you talk about the different groups, right? And there's the visionaries that are at the helm of startup companies, right? And that's what we see, a tremendous amount of. And then there are the enthusiasts who are really seeking to persuade and not just educate, right? And so it's really interesting because I think everyone who worked in healthcare in 2020 and 2021 in kind of any way, shape, or form, right? We all had family or friends, especially as vaccines started to become available, right? We all got the question. So what do is the hushed kind of corner of the, whatever kind of gathering you were doing at the time, right? But it was, so what are your thoughts on this, right? And I cut my teeth making vaccines, right? Those were all of my first positions, right? Both kind of monoclonal antibodies and then also flu. And so those are really frequent conversations. And I don't know that it's just an interesting thing to consider that there are approaches that are going to resonate better and that are going to work better, right? And there's actually a lot of conversation about this in the scientific community now and kind of at large because we see some distrust that's going on, right? And so I don't know. Do you have any kind of comments on that in terms of what would be your maybe words of wisdom for folks as they're thinking about engaging in those kinds of conversations, or maybe they're dreading them, right? And they really don't want to because they are charged subjects, right?
Yeah. I have two primary comments on this. And the first is it's very important that in any science communication or science marketing that we are thinking about the end consumer of whatever marketing we're putting out. And typically you have multiple audiences. If we are talking about any sort of company in the life sciences, your buyers are not necessarily your end users. You might be selling to multiple personas, is what we call them in the marketing context. You might need to have conversations with IT about a LIMS system, not just the laboratory manager, right? And so you need to understand how to communicate to each of those different audience segments. Their personas can be helpful and develop messaging that's appropriate for each audience. Otherwise, they're going to get lost in perhaps the technical details of your LIMS system if you're talking to IT. And by technical, I don't mean the IT technical, I mean sort of the scientific technical, right?
Compliance and yep.
Exactly, exactly. And so, there's one side of this, which is really around how do we communicate with different audience segments. In the marketing world, we might develop personas to represent, who is the IT person you're going to need to communicate with about this LIMS system. You're not ever just selling, or it's very rare anyway, that you are only selling to one decision maker. It's usually most of these buy decisions are made by teams, and that makes sense. But then there's this other piece of how do you communicate with the general public and rebuild some of that trust that's been lost to science. And this is actually something that is very, very important to me. I'm working on a project called the Science Advocacy Alliance, which is a nonprofit that I'm hoping will help rebuild some of this trust to defend federal science agency from budget freezes and misinformation. But we're certainly at a critical point in public trust in science. And I really believe that arming researchers, whether we're talking about academic researchers, whether we're talking about scientists within commercial companies, we need to arm them with strong communication skills. Because I think once the general public more broadly understands, they don't need to know everything about a vaccine in order to trust that there are people who do. And there are many people who know very different parts of how a vaccine is developed, from the basic science all the way through to manufacturing and how it's delivered to you. And we don't need everybody to be an expert and understand the science deeply. This idea that people who take vaccines need to do their own research is a really scary one, right? Because we know, who are in this industry, that it takes years to develop the background in order to do your own research. And so what we're really talking about is a lack of trust in scientists and engineers and what they do day to day. And I think that's very disappointing. And we need to make sure that every scientist, no matter what they're doing, has strong communication skills to help bridge this gap organically over time. Because honestly, scientists and engineers are rock stars, and they are the backbone of our economy in the United States, our competitiveness. They're what keeps us safe. And we need to really make sure that the public in general is incredibly trustful of these institutions so that you get the funding that you need and we don't see blocks to basic things like public health needs.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me, I had a mentor in undergrad that talked about, if you look at the modern computer, right, and how many people in the world can actually, with some good level of articulation and knowledge, explain everything about how a computer works, right? And his contention, and this was 15, 18 years ago, was there's probably only a handful, right, in the entire world. There may be zero now, right? As things continue to get more and more complex, and you talk about even just processors. So you've alluded to the same point in pharma, right? Drug development, just, discovery, right? We work in that space very, very little, but then through to manufacturing, you have specialties upon specialties upon specialties. So you commented in the book about kind of having this balance between analysis and creativity. And then also, there can be an over reliance on data, and that can be our default inclination as scientists and engineers. And then on the flip side, or maybe in a correlated fashion, right, there can be paralysis by analysis. And we see that a lot in startup, in the startup kind of venture space. And I don't know if it's a byproduct of academia where the driver is knowledge, period, right? In general, especially if you're a tenured professor, right? That's your remit, is grants and references in academic papers. But do you think is that a byproduct of how we're educating scientists and engineers, or is it a reality of the system? Like, I'm curious, what's your opinion on that?
It's a mix of both, and I would never say don't get strong data to support your no. So but I think you're absolutely right. You nailed it. That scientists are trained to get data and the ones who are more successful in the entrepreneurial ecosystem tend to be ones who can tell a good story using that data, and that's great. That's what we want more of. But I think that to your other points, and something I've encountered a lot, and that's why I wrote about it in the book, is marketing data does not need to be analyzed at the same level as your clinical data. And so, it's okay to run a failed marketing campaign. And in fact, sometimes we want those failures just like you want early lab failures, right? We
Yeah.
want to know what isn't going to work. Not everything will. We run message tests. We run imagery tests. If we're developing a brand, we're doing that not to make a logo that looks pretty and a color palette that your founder is going to love. We want to develop a brand that's going to resonate with your first investors, your end users, wherever you might be in your brand development phase, right? So I think it's very, very important that we come to this with a balance and good communication from an entrepreneurial perspective, especially from a fundraising perspective and getting your first customers. It's not always going to be about the data. You use the data as a proof point. It becomes a messaging proof point to use when appropriate. It's not the end all be all of your pitch, so to speak. So it's a balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you give a lot of really good nuts and bolts, advice in the book, ranging from, kind of email updates versus blogs and what's appropriate for each, and white papers, and you actually even talk about podcasts. So hopefully we don't break any of those advisements in here, right? And just a lot of things, even how to attend trade shows, right? And how to be smart about it, and so many things that I feel like I've learned from the School of Hard Knocks, in terms of doing sales and business development. So thanks for tuning in to Life Science Solutions, presented by Kymanox and produced by WalkWest. If today's conversation with Elizabeth sparked new ideas for your organization, check out her book, The Giant's Ladder, and learn more at hightouch.group. For more insights like this, subscribe and follow Life Science Solutions wherever you get your podcast. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring what it takes to bring life science innovation to life, because patients deserve better.